It's the appointed time. We have a quorum. Let's get started with the meeting today. Information paper issued since the last meeting. The Secretariat has issued no information paper since the last meeting. There was an item on today's agenda on the studies related to the artificial islands in the central waters. I was in touch with the government. We wanted to allow more time for members to peruse the relevant papers. The government would get the papers ready as soon as possible, just so to give members more time to go through the papers. And there may be a lot of members who wish to have an extensive discussion on that item. Now, given we already have 2 items today, it may not be a good idea to pack everything into the meeting today, so we will have a special meeting just for that item. For members who cannot make it at a special meeting, or members who have other comments, they are welcome to write to me and I will follow up accordingly. We now move on to the second item on the agenda, Capital Works Reserve Fund block allocation for 2023 to 24. We will now invite the government officials to join us. There are many officials who will be joining us for this agenda item. After all, this item covers a range of matters. Members who wish to put questions, please press the button now. Welcome. The papers were issued. There are no PowerPoint slides to go with the paper, so we will jump right into the questions and answer session. Members who have indicated they wish to speak, there are 4 members: Mr. Edward Lau, Mr. Andrew Lam, Ms. Judy Chen, and Mr. Chen Hock Fong. Mr. Edward Lau, 5 minutes for you. This is about the Capital Works Reserve Fund. I support this proposal, but I do have some questions for the government. My questions may have something to do with proposals to streamline future procedures. The money for land resumption will be separate from the Capital Works funding, and people think land resumption will bypass logical discussions. In fact, the land resumption funding will fall under the Capital Works Reserve Fund. Members of the Legislature will discuss the work related to land resumption. There is one example in this paper, Annex 1B 7100CA. There is this land resumption in Tai Po for public housing and a public school. The work project was covered by the panel on housing a couple of weeks ago, but it remains unknown when this item will be tabled at the Finance Committee. This project falls under this paper for the compensation-related funding. So this is for compensation for settlement, etc. If this item fails to secure funding at the Finance Committee, what will happen? This is a chance for the government to clarify matters. Who's going to take this question, please? The Assistant Director of the Lands Department will take this question. Ms. Lily Chiu. Mr. Lau, the member, is right to point out that the funding under Head 701 is for compensation. After we secure the funding, the item will go ahead, and only when the resumption happens, then the funding will be used. After we resume the land under the law, we have to offer compensation in accordance with the law. So we need to secure the funding, have the money ready, and then once the work project is approved, then we tap into the funding. The member can rest assured that electoral members will get to scrutinize and comment on the work project. So the government is trying to secure the funding in advance so that the money is ready. Now, for people affected by the land resumption, they don't get the compensation until very late. When procedures are streamlined in the future, does that mean the money the government secures now will be able to offer earlier compensation to the people affected? Ms. Lily Chiu, this is about getting the money ready. Once we streamline the procedures, land resumption will happen more quickly. But we offer compensation only after the resumption happens. The point about our legislative amendment exercises is that we don't have to wait till the project funding is secured, and we can already get started with the land resumption. That's the difference with our current practice. For a work project, once the land resumption is finalized, but then the work itself may not be able to go ahead yet, the amendment will allow us to proceed with land resumption first. For work project, it is already discussed that the town planning stage changes rarely happen, but for the legislative amendment, we're trying to give ourselves the flexibility to proceed with land resumption earlier on. The law has not been amended yet. The government is securing the funding just so the money is ready. There is an established principle governing compensation for land resumption. Now, for ex gratia compensation, there is also an established mechanism. The deputy chairman of this panel also notes that the estimate for next year, 2023-24, shows a huge jump from the allocation for this year. This may mean the government expects a huge increase in land resumption that will happen. There is a mechanism governing the securing of funding and what happens next. But the people affected by land resumption wonder if it's possible to offer the compensation more quickly. Can the people affected be given compensation more quickly? After all, the money is already ready. Chairman, you're right to point out that we expect there will be a lot more new projects and ongoing projects in the days to come. That's why there's a huge increase in the estimate for 2023 to 24. After our legislative amendment, we will proceed with compensation as quickly as possible. For residents and operators affected by land resumption, we offer the compensation when they move out. After the legislative amendment goes through, we will arrange the disbursement of funds to the people affected as long as they're willing to leave the area affected. We will do what we can to make that happen. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam. Mr. Edward Lau has already touched on part of my question. For compensation, ex gratia compensation, and funding for works projects, there may be changes that happen down the road, especially for compensation amount. If the money that is required turns out to be different from what we have anticipated, will the variation be reflected in the estimate next year? Or do we just get a grand total for the money involved? Ms. Margaret Shaw. Chair, Ms. Lily Chiu will elaborate on this point. There's an overall estimate for the project. This paper is about the cash flow for compensation covering 2023 to 24. This is the grand total for the money for compensation. And then we will work out the money needed for 2024 to 25. So we will try to stay within the total amount. Say when you spend less money than your estimate, is that a case of delays in your land resumption process? Or is it because of changes in the price levels? I cannot see what happens in the process. Do the papers reflect situations like these? Ms. Lily Chiu. This year, we explain why there is unused amount from the previous year's estimate. In this case, that's because some title holders have not accepted our compensation or there are disputes with the land titles. The result is that some people have not received their compensation yet. Now, will there be changes to our compensation? We calculate the compensation based on the notice of land resumption. The land resumption has to happen first before we offer compensation. Once the notice of land resumption is out, the price will remain unchanged because the price will be based on the day on which the resumption notice is out. There will be no change to the compensation as an amount. The only variation will be something like interest. There are two annexes, and there are many pages in the paper. There is detailed information in the annexes covering the ongoing project in 2022-23. For 2023 to 24, there are also new projects. Members can refer to the information. That's a lot of information. So that's where more detailed information is available.
Any follow-up? Next, Ms. Judy Chan. Thank you, Chairman. I have a couple of questions. First, on position, and second, on 707. I read the papers from last year, and last year, out of the Capital Works Reserve Fund, 13.9 billion was related to capital works, and this actually created 20,000 jobs. And out of these 210,000 work months per person. So how come we don't see this figure for this year's paper? Because I see it from last year's paper. What were the considerations for that? The construction industry always say that they either have too much work or either they see no work at all. We must know how many job positions can be created and also make sure that all the work can be followed through smoothly. And the second question is relation to head 7077100X. So that's actually was raised that in 5 years, all the 90% of the roads should be connected. The paper stated that there should be a site investigation and feasibility investigation, and we are talking about over 50 million. So under this promenade, around the island trail on Hong Kong Island. So how are we going to connect this? We've heard about ecology and country parks in the southern part of Hong Kong Island. So you work on the feasibility study and investigation. Would you also ask the consultant to consider whether all the roads can be connected in the future? I'd like to first defer to Mr. Chen to answer the first question, and then for the second question, I will defer to the Highways Department. Is it Mr. Fong? Sorry, it should be Mr. Fong. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Chen, for your question. On the creation of job opportunities, in last year's papers, we listed this out in the PWSC papers. We've never actually listed this out in any of the panels. We are talking about 13.6 billion allocation to capital works, and we also believe that there will be a creation of 20,000 jobs. So that will be 18,000 works in the construction sector, and then actually 2,000 non-industry workers. And so I'm also talking about over 200,000 man hours per month. We are going to continuously move ahead with more construction projects in housing and in capital works. We have always been making an effort in adopting measures such as providing 1 billion into CIC to train up workers. We hope to train over 27,000 workers, and we have also been raising awareness in the public in the professionalism in the construction sector and to provide more internship opportunities for young people. So this is what we have been doing in terms of training. We also hope to raise our productivity. With all these construction projects coming up, not only do we need workers, we also need to work more in technology. Therefore, we have the Innovation Fund, which has injected over 2.2 billion to encourage the sector to adopt new advanced technology to enhance the productivity of the construction sector. That is all I have for now. Who would like to take the question on the promenade? Mr. Fang? Ms. Chan, you are correct in saying what you have said about the Round the Island Trail. Basically, we see that we need connections to connect up the southern district. There are some areas that are under protection, some parts belonging to country parks. Therefore, we need more in-depth study and investigation before we can come up with a more ideal connection. This is what we are going to do in the way forward. Would you also answer the question on the feasibility of stretching this along to other areas of the promenade? There are two sides to that. For those that do not involve areas of needing high technical difficulty, we are going to gradually begin work on that in the second half of next year. In the policy address of the CE, within 5 years, our target is to connect about 90%. And what is remaining would be about 60 kilometers of the 6 kilometers remaining. So that would be with high ecological value or with a bit more technical difficulty that we will have to leave for later. At the current moment, we hope that by the end of 2023, we'll be able to complete the study of the Round the Island Trail. So the 22 million would also include the 25 million would also include the feasibility of study of the Round the Island Trail. Well, I'm talking about those that do not involve a lot of areas of marine parks or high ecological value. Then we would be able to complete that by the end of the next year. And then we can begin on that in the year after. Mr. Chen Hock-fong, thank you. I basically agree to the plans. I'd like to talk about Head 701, Subhead 104CA on the loss of redevelopment potential rising from underground strata resumption in West Island Line. I think we've used that for over 8 years. So there's about a loss of redevelopment potential estimate of 0.5 million. So is someone really seeking compensation? Your project estimate is 1.69 million. You're only asking about around 500,000 this year. I think that it doesn't seem to be a very high figure. I want to know what the latest updates are. The other is Head 703, Subhead 3101GX, Line 3. So it's on the Hon CHAN in the Hon CHAN building. So I believe that the Wan Chai building, we already looking into reprovisioning. How come you still need to use around tens of millions of dollars for the fitting out of court-related office and storage accommodation in Revenue Tower of Wan Chai? And then another question on Head 707, Subhead 7016GX. So I've always been talking about that when I was a district councillor. So this is actually similar to the Round the Island Trail that we've been talking about earlier. But then you're only focusing on the Round the Island Trail, but then on the right side there's actually a ferry pier, and to the left it's sort of like cut off. Would that also include the connection of promenade so that it could link up the 60 kilometers promenade road? So is the estimate including that? And then on the Pier 5, on the temporary resting area of the construction of waterfront open space at Pier number 5 of Western Wholesale Food Market. I know that in Sai Ying Pun, they're working on renovation work. So I'd like to understand the design of Pier number 5. Would it not be consistent with the design of their design? So are you going to follow with the designs of Pier number 1 to 4 or follow with the designs of Pier number 5, because they are of different styles? All right, who would like to take these questions? Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the questions. On 1004CA, so I'll defer that to Ms. Lily Chiu. Ms. Chiu. So on the cash flow of the West Island line, we are dealing with one compensation. So that is why we need to leave the estimate to pay for that compensation. And then on Wan Chai 3106GA, I would like to defer to Mr. Sin. Thank you. On the revenue tower in Wan Chai, basically we need to add in facilities relating to family tribunals. The new district courts, before they can be commissioned, we do need temporary courts to handle family tribunal cases. Therefore, we are going to retrofit the vacant space in the revenue tower for that purpose. So how many years would you need to use that for? Well, we're going to use it for a period of time. I believe that we'll use those fitting out offices for a few years. Well, how many years? So you're spending 27 million for only a few years? No, the total project estimate is 43 million, and you're only using that for a few years. How many years exactly? We have to wait till the new district court be ready before we can move there. I actually do not have any updates on the new building. Well, so that means you don't have the answer for us now. I think you should need to provide us with the answer later on, because at least we want to make sure that we are paying, there is value for money, because we don't want to only spend tens of millions to use for only a few years. Otherwise, there other arrangements should be made. So please supplement us with this later on.
Aye.
Now, the Western Promenade. Who's going to take this question, please? Mr. Au. Chair. Now, as for the promenade near Cadogan Street, this will be 286 meters in length, connecting the pedestrian sidewalks on either side. There are some existing facilities in the area, so we can only go that far in connecting the pavement. Mr. Chen. Any follow-up question from you? So there's a gap in the trail. That means you cannot have around the island trail. And what about the wholesale market? Mr. Ao? Now for the wholesale food market, there is a pedestrian footpath. With some improvement works, we can make that happen. There's a building right next to it, so we have to figure out a way to overcome this difficulty. So you're looking into what to do about it. Mr. Chan, please. I will wait for my next round. Next, Dr. Wendy Hong. Chair, I speak in support of this block allocation. I do have questions about two subheads. Head 701, 1100CA, Project 33. This is about resumption for Tai Po, for public rental housing project and a public school in Tai Po. Education bodies in Tai Po have already told the Education Bureau time and again there are not enough students in the area. There is already controversy over the relocation plans of a school. So my question is this money going to be used for reprovisioning a primary school? How many students can the schools accommodate? And for 3100GX being the subhead under head 703. A lot of it is feasibility studies or consultancy fees under category D under public works programs. These are money that ranges from a few $1,000,000 to tens of $1,000,000. So compared to economies of similar sizes, how do we compare in terms of our consultancy fees? How do we compare with Singapore in terms of our consultancy fees? Are we paying a lot more than Singapore do? A lot of times I see staggering consultancy fees after all. Now for 1100CA, that is the subhead. Ms. Lily Chiu will take that question for the second part of the question. For the schools, I will invite Mr. Fong from the Development Bureau to take that question. So we will start with Ms. Lily Chiu. Now for Chung A Road in Tai Po, that is the public housing project. The CEDD and the Housing Authority have provided us with information. The school involved is a primary school. The provision is there for compensation once the project starts. Now, as for the work project, the government needs to secure project funding. Once that happens, we will proceed with the compensation for land resumption. My question has to do with the lack of students in the area. If you have a new school in that area, where do you find the students for that school? Is this project for reprovisioning an existing primary school, or is the government going to construct a new school? And maybe the CEDD can come in with information here. As far as I'm aware, the project is about a primary school, but I don't have information on whether this is a reprovisioning project. Who can take this question, please? Mr. Wong. For the project on Chung A Road, we briefed members of the panel on housing. So that land resumption can happen as quickly as possible. Now, as for the primary school, as far as we are aware, the Education Bureau is considering a reprovisioning project. But as for the specifics, the Education Bureau will make the final decision on this matter. Mr. Fan from the Education Bureau, can you give us a response? Mr. Fan, Mr. Samuel Fan from the Education Bureau. We have a school allocation exercise for new schools. When a school sponsoring body wants to set up a new school, we go through that exercise. Now, as for the project on Chung A Road, is it for reprovisioning or building a new school? I don't have information at hand on that. But once we do have school premises for use, we go through an open process. School sponsoring bodies are invited. And then we decide whether we will have a reprovisioning project or building a new school. Can the government provide us with supplementary information after the meeting? As for consultancy fee, Mr. Fong, can you give us a response? We engage consultants for large-scale works projects. Consultants play a key role. They are professionals. They conduct professional assessments, design, and research for us. There's a lot of advanced site investigation and analysis. We are hiring a group of experts to help us out with assessment and design for our work project. These professional groups help us with our large-scale work project. The consultant fees make up roughly 3 to 5% of the total project cost, but this is a rough idea. It all depends on the complexity and scale of each project. I don't have the figures in Singapore. For consultants in Hong Kong, from our perspective, there's room for upward adjustment for these consultant fees. After all, consultants represent a group of professionals. They play a key role in the process. It's money worth spending because the work of these consultants help us take forward public works projects. The consultant fees are at a reasonable level. Now, here's something from our experience. We had a project. This consultant has all along worked on studies. There's room for enhancing the design, so we paid this consultant an extra $1 million to help us enhance an aspect of our project. That proved to be money well spent. After the enhancement, we managed to save $100 million for the whole project. This goes to show the value of consultants, the professionals. That's my response. Next, Dr. Lo Wai Kwok. Chair, this is Capital Works Reserve Fund. This is part of the established mechanism. The mechanism has been around for many years. Once the money exceeds a certain amount, the government needs to come to the electrical for funding. That is, the government has to go through the relevant panel. Say, if it's a school, the government has to go to the panel on education, and then the item goes to the Public Works Subcommittee, where members discuss the details, and then the funding proposal goes to the Finance Committee. Under our current circumstances, the funding gets voted on. So this is the three-step process. If it's a project below a certain threshold, the project falls under the Capital Works Reserve Fund. So this is really the expenses for smaller projects, and also includes the computerization project and also land acquisition project. For different projects, the limits are adjusted with regard to a range of factors like inflation. So the limit now is $50 million. So for a project that involves more than $50 million, the three-step process applies. Now, for the universal accessibility project, this is given a higher limit at $75 million. For computerization, the limit is at $20 million. Land acquisition goes by another limit. When filibustering was still here and there were still those people seeking mutual destruction, this project, the Capital Works Reserve Fund, this item was an opportunity for those people to engage in filibustering. Because the Capital Works Reserve Fund needs to go through the Finance Committee before money can be spent on all those projects. And even for small projects, minor projects, the smaller engineering firms took their grievances to me because the people engaging in filibusterings delayed the approval for the funding. You need time after the approval of the funding and work to start. Things were very tough back then. Now we have an improved electoral system. We now have good governance. We can tell that we are taking scrutiny of public works projects very seriously. Projects get approved. This is also what people want because all these projects are related to people's livelihood. I don't have specific questions, but I do want to find out from you, that is from the government, a timetable. There were delays in the past. The Capital Works Reserve Fund was not approved by the Finance Committee until late March in the past. That led to chaos. Contractors and consultants also suffered as a result. If we support this proposal, then the item goes to the Public Works Subcommittee and finally the Finance Committee. What's the timetable that the government has in mind? I thank Dr. Lo for his support. We will apply for roughly $250 million, $25 billion. These projects have to do with people's livelihood. So we want to secure the funding as quickly as possible. If we get the support of this panel, next month, that is January 2023, the item goes to the Public Works Subcommittee, so that by March we want to have this approved by the Finance Committee. So this is roughly for $25.5 billion. That's at a comparable level to what we saw in recent years. With more projects being taken forward, that means the government can better look after the interest of the people. Next, Ms. Doreen Kong. Chair, in principle, I support livelihood-related project. But I have questions about the specifics. Subhead 5001BX under head 705. This is for landslip prevention and investigation. I don't have the specific locations. I don't see that in the paper. Can we have a list of the specific locations covered by those projects? I still see some references to projects in 2017 in this paper. Does that mean there are projects that started in 2017 and remain in progress to this date? Why is it that these projects remain incomplete? Under the new items, item 4 and item 10, From item 4 through item 10 under the new projects, what are those projects for? Head 710, subhead A007GX, that's computerization. Those projects are costly. In 2013 and 14, there was a huge funding request back then. The projects this time around has to do with the management and development. Why are we still spending so much money on this? This is $1.8 billion. Does it mean that we have to rely on outside contractors for upgrading our computer infrastructure?
As a member of the public, since we're spending so much money to enhance computerization, is there some sort of effect that we can see very obviously? Is there something more tangible so that we can really see the efficiencies enhanced through computerization? And currently, we see that many of the systems are independent in each department. Can we actually connect the systems so that we can be more effective in our administration? Thank you. Let me first answer the question on A007GX. According to normal procedures, when there is anything related to new technology, then on December 9th of this year, actually the government department has already discusses with the broadcast authority. Currently, we do not have any updates, but we're happy to relay your question to the authority. As for 5001BX, I would like to defer to Mr. Fong, the Director of CEDD. Thank you, Ms. Kong, for your question. I do not have the specifics of each particular project, but I can tell you about this generally. For the landslip preventive works, we set a target each year. We would have around 150 man-made slopes that need to be strengthened, and then for 30 natural slopes we would also need to mitigate the risks. Every year, therefore, we work on similar projects, and year by year there would be a couple of adjustments in the numbers, but basically that's what we do every year. Man-made slopes, private man-made slopes, or natural slopes all have a very huge number. Therefore, we will divide these up into categories and then engage the services of consultants. You may ask why the estimate is similar for each package. That is because we do have such a differentiation. Ms. Kong, if you would like more specific details, I would need to ask my colleague for the information and supplement them later. Thank you. Chairman, I hope to see this in writing because we're talking about a total of 1 billion in estimates each year. All right, how about you provide this information after the meeting? Next, Dr. Stephen Wong. Thank you, Chairman. In general, I support this item. Head 701, and then on subhead 100CA on the sewage in territories near Mok Hung Chun. According to my understanding, I've actually asked about this in the panel for environment. I think Mok Hung's this sewage will be linked up to Set-Wu-Hui sewage plant. And I remember I asked at the we are currently now in the panel for development. According to the Northern Development, the Set-Wu-Hui sewage plant would be reprovisioned because it is right in the core of the northern metropolis. In the environmental panel, I asked whether this would be moved, and then according to the Environmental Bureau's paper, it seems that they're not looking into moving this. I would like to ask this question again in this panel. So would you consider moving the sewage plant in Set-Wu-Hui? If yes, then why are we still going to approve funding for the sewage connection? How long would this be used for, and when would the actual move be? Well, first of all, would there be such a move, and if yes, when would it be? Let's say it is to be reprovisioned. So when would the new one be commissioned? As that information would let us know how long we would be able to use this for. Mr. Choi from the Drainage Services. Oh, thank you. So this money is for land resumption. The sewage project, we're just following along with the main project. I actually do not have the details on the project. I would provide you with the information after the meeting. Now, Dr. Wong is concerned that even that you might just be wasting the money because you're going to reprovision the sewage plant later on. The Development Bureau said that it belongs to the Northern Metropolis, but then for the Environmental Bureau, it seems that there is no information for them to have to move the sewage plant. I really want to know whether it would be moved and when it would be, and how long would this be used for, because we want to ensure that the money is well spent. Mr. Choi, you understand the question. Please provide us with the answer after the meeting. Thank you. Next, it's my turn. I also have a couple of questions. I would like further elaboration. First, on the Hon CHAN Central Bypass. Let me look back into the paper. It's Annex 1B, Item 9. So that is on page 5, the Central Hon CHAN Bypass and the Island Eastern Corridor link. The estimate is around 361 million, and next year estimate will be around 200 million. Can you tell us more about the project, since the bypass has been used for a period of time? And then turning to page 6, a new item on the Central Government Complex, Legislative Council Complex, Exhibition Gallery and Civic Place at Tamar Central, Hong Kong. So estimate for next year will be around 6 million, but then the project estimate is around 137 million. So can you please elaborate on this project? On page 21, on the landscape improvement works at Cheung Sha Wan Sewage Pumping Station, is the government looking into improving landscape at all the sewage pumping stations, or is that the only one? Please provide us with more details. Thank you, Chairman. Highways Department will take the question on the Central Wan Chai bypass. Mr. Zhang or Mr. Ng? Mr. Ng, please. That is in relation to post-project estimate. I don't have the information right now, but I can actually provide this with the answer after the meeting. Well, yes, because the Central Wan Chai bypass has been used for a period of time. We hope that other construction items surrounding it can be completed as soon as possible. How about the other questions? Who is going to take the other questions on the Tamar Exhibition Gallery? Is that a new item? That's a proposed new item. Page 6. Oh, that would be taken by the Lands Department. Well, these are actually reserved for the compensation, and it's not part of the construction. For the Central Wan Chai bypass, as the Highways Department said, the project is completed, but there is still some sort of compensation not yet paid out. So there's actually an estimate under Head 701 that will be made next year. That's also the same with Tamar. It's also for compensation because we're going to provide a universal access footpath, which will be begun next year. There is no land resumption involved. Only some sort of land title issue. So that is for compensation. How about the Changsha Wan sewage pumping station question? Drainage services, please, Mr. Choi. Thank you, Chairman. The landscape improvement works at Changsha Wan sewage pumping station is to be done because during our usual and regular maintenance and inspection, we would look at the surroundings and consider the impact on the surroundings. When our buildings pose a risk or it doesn't look consistent with the landscape, it looks old and dilapidated, we try our best to improve it so that it can actually enhance the landscape vision. Well, we always talk about landscape or the visual impact. Well, it seems from your answer, Mr. Choi, that this is just due to what you found from your regular maintenance and inspection and not because many of the sewage pumping stations are not designed aesthetically in the first place. Would you actually fight for resources to improve the landscape near all the sewage pumping stations in Hong Kong? Can you actually consider doing that and to ask for all resources? It seems that this is just coincidentally that it has been found very dilapidated due to regular inspection.
Chair, we're not taking a piecemeal approach in repairs. Once we have a works project, we consider whether it's possible to perform improvement works in Sha Tin. There are projects going on. They involve the pumping houses. In these cases, we consider ways to improve the appearance of those facilities. So we keep in view our facilities and look for room for improvement. Next, Mr. Chen Hock-fong speaking for the second round. Chair, to follow up on the revenue tower point I was raising, the government will provide supplementary information after the meeting, but I'm looking for some further information here. The timeline, how long will the facility be used? Are there alternative plans? Do we have to spend so much money on the renovation and have the family court? For renovation works like this, is there a requirement on a minimum year of usage for a facility that goes through renovation? Can the government provide a consolidated response on this? Can you give us a response now? The Architectural Services Department, Mr. Sin, will give us a response. We will provide a consolidated response in our written response later. There's one about demolishing the pedestrian footbridge. There are many footbridges in Hong Kong, but some of them come with a low usage rate. So now there is a plan to demolish that footbridge. Has the government reviewed the footbridges in Hong Kong? Are there footbridges with very low usage rate? Maintenance of such footbridges amounts to a waste of money. Are there consultants engaged to look into this problem? Ms. Margaret Shah. Chair, Highways Department will take this question. Mr. Ng. For the footbridge you're referring to, in 2020, there was a fire. The people in the area realize not many people use the footbridge, and there are hygienic issues associated with the footbridge. After extensive discussion, we decided to demolish that footbridge. Now, for other footbridges with a low usage rate, the Transport Department reviews the situation. Does that mean there will be more footbridges to be demolished? I'm not aware of further cases of footbridges that require follow-up. We will have regard to comments from local residents and then review the situation together with the Transport Department. Can the government have a discussion with the Transport Department on consultation of local residents to decide whether it still makes sense to keep those footbridges with a low usage rate? Tearing these footbridges down will save money. So for this item, Capital Works Reserve Fund block allocations, no further questions for this item. Do members support submission of this item to the Public Works Subcommittee for further submission? I note that members generally support the submission of this item to the Public Works Subcommittee. This means, depending on discussion The panel on development supports the submission of this item to the Public Works Subcommittee. I will ask the relevant government department to provide supplementary information in response to the questions raised by members today. I have received the written questions from Ms. Chan Yuet-ming. I will pass on the letter from Ms. Chen to the government so that the government can provide a consolidated written response. I thank the government officials for attending the meeting today. We now move on to the next item on the agenda. Agenda item number 3, proposal of implementing title registration on newly granted land. We will now invite the government officials to join us. Members who wish to speak, please press the button now. We welcome the government officials joining us for this item. The list of attendants have been circulated among members, so I will not go through the officials one by one. The government officials will walk us through the paper with PowerPoint slides. Ms. Doris Hall, Permanent Secretary of the Development Bureau, please. I will offer a brief introduction, and then my colleague will go over the plan in detail. Our current land registration regime is a deed registration system. This is just about a registration, that is recording only. This is not about ascertaining the title of a piece of land. For those with experience in property transaction, the solicitors for the parties will have to go through all the historical documents about, that is, the title deed, etc., to ascertain the title. Given this problem, we want to offer greater certainty and clarity on title. So in 2004, the government enacted the Land Titles Ordinance. Under that ordinance, there is a title registration system to replace the current deed registration system. The proposal back then would be applicable to newly granted land and also currently granted land. The ordinance was passed by the Legislative Council back in 2004. The title registration system is in line with the practice of other common law jurisdictions like Singapore, Australia, and also the mainland. But then title issues are at stake. This involves private property and protection for private property. Even after the enactment of the Land Titles Ordinance, the LegCo back then asked the government to discuss the matter with various stakeholders. After years of discussion, the government floated various proposals, but the stakeholders have yet to reach a consensus on the key issues, such as the conversion of the title under the old regime to the new regime, and then when fraud happens, what should be done in the way of rectification and compensation or indemnity. That's why this piece of legislation enacted in 2004 has yet to commence operation. In view of stakeholders' comment, the government proposes to implement the title registration system on newly granted land. Hence, there is this new land first proposal as stated in the paper. This proposal enjoys widespread support among stakeholders. The benefit of the title registration system is that once you have a bona fide buyer in possession of the property for value, this buyer has irrevocable title to the property that offers greater certainty of title. With the title registration system, future property transactions will also see a streamlined process because the solicitors will no longer have to go through all the historical title documents over the previous 15 years. Simply put, that means a more streamlined process that will take less time. So we propose this new land first proposal so that members of the public can build confidence in the new system, and we can also have this new land first proposal as a demonstration so that in the future the title registration system can be applied to existing land as well. My final point, as part of the new land first proposal, we will explore disapplying the adverse possession principle to newly granted land. That means the proposal is that newly granted land will not be subject to adverse possession. Again, this is about providing greater certainty about title. I now give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Joyce Tam. As Ms. Doris Ho was saying, we now have a deed registration system. The ordinance, that is the land registration system, was first enacted in 1844. That means the law has been in place for more than 170 years. The system is just about recording. This is not about ascertaining the title. Solicitors have to go through title deeds for at least 15 years, and this process has to be repeated for every transaction. The title holder has to keep the deed and pass the deeds to the next buyer. This means a time-consuming and repetitive system. Hong Kong is among the few economies with this deed registration system. In 2004, the Land Titles Ordinance was enacted. Under this ordinance, the title register determines the title. So the title register will be conclusive evidence of title. This means greater guarantee, greater certainty, and also a streamlined conveyancing process. There is also an indemnity system so that those suffering a loss of property through fraud, these people can get indemnity subject to a cap. That's extra protection for these victims. There were some major revisions to the Land Titles Ordinance. The government pledged an extensive consultation of stakeholders before the enactment to make sure the ordinance can work. Some committees were set up to supervise the relevant work. Stakeholders have been consulted, and there were discussions on key issues. First, conversion of the land currently registered under the Land Registration Ordinance to the new regime. There may be cases of indeterminate ownership under the deed registration system. Once you have an automatic conversion mechanism, that may raise questions over the accuracy of the titles. And there's also the problem with property with title defect. The second question has to do with the rectification of title. Say there's a fraud before the property transaction. Should the previous owner be allowed to resume his or her title through mandatory rectification. And then there is also this principle of irrevocable title or indefeasible title. The new purchaser should be able to keep the property. There is substantial discussion on this.
Third, on whether the previous ownership could actually recover the ownership, and that the innocent party that suffers loss of ownership should be compensation. Should there actually be a cap to such a indemnity, and whether it would be subject to a cap would also affect the level of contributions required for setting up the self-financing indemnity fund. As there was no consensus reached, this still has not come into effect. In order to implement this as soon as possible, the government has proposed a new Land First proposal with the support of stakeholders. So generally speaking, new land covers land granted by the government on or after the commencement date of the LTO, including land granted by way of land sale such as auction or tender, private treaty grant, and land exchange. That is, land regranted after surrender. Next, I would like to talk about some of the benefits of new land first option. One is the certainty of the title. So the title register is conclusive evidence of title. So if there is a bona fide purchaser for value and in possession of the property, that person will enjoy indefeasible title even in the event of a transfer of property achieved through the fraud of a third party. So back to the scenario I mentioned just now, even though there is a fraud of a third party, the bona fide purchaser will still have the title certainty. And in such cases, the innocent former owner failing to recover the property will be entitled to indemnity. And that is broadly in line with that in other jurisdictions with title registration regimes. However, if the purchaser did not buy the property for value or not in possession of it, the court would have the discretion to decide whether to restore the title to the former owner. At the same time, we're actively considering the feasibility of disapplying the adverse possession laws to new land registered under the LTO. In other words, any claims for adverse possession would be barred for land with title registered under the new land first proposal, because the purpose of the title registration system is to give certainty to title. I've already talked about the simplified conveyancing procedures. There is no need to check or safekeep historical title documents for verifying the title to the properties. And it will simplify the conveyancing procedures and reduce the risk of loss of title documents. Persons who suffer a loss due to fraud will be eligible for compensation subject to a cap. And then I will talk more about the indemnity procedures later on. Under the new land first option, we can provide enhanced protection to registered owners. For properties to enjoy the indefeasible title, then 3 requirements must be met. That is, the purchaser must be bona fide, that person has acquired the property for value, and thirdly, is in possession of the property. Solicitors will be required under law to verify applications, including performing checking on the identity, capacity, and authority of parties, and ensuring the due execution of documents lodged with the LR. And so they must verify the application, and solicitors will continue to become a gatekeeper for the property. the the title certificates with advanced anti-forgery features will be issued automatically to registered owners upon registration of transfer. And upon disposal of the property, the issued title certificate will have to be returned to the LL for cancellation. And the Lands Registry will provide a free alert service for registered owners. So when there is an application for registration lodged against their properties and also upon the completion of registration, the Lands Registry will provide a notification in the form of email followed by SMS. So that will enable registered owners to discover possible fraud at an early stage and take appropriate action as soon as practicable. A fraudster will continue to be criminally liable for his action in a fraudulent transfer as under the deeds registration system. If the government has already provided indemnity to a person with loss of ownership, then that person will also be liable. The new Land First proposal can also enable Hong Kong to be on par with other jurisdictions. It can help enhance the efficiency of property conveyancing and improve the business environment and raise Hong Kong's competitiveness. We hope that by implementing the new Land First proposal, it will facilitate all parties in reaching a consensus on the implementation of title registration system on existing land. Overseas experience shows that the full migration to title registration can be a prolonged process, and in the interim, the deeds registration system and title registration system will exist simultaneously. I will now talk about the proposed indemnity arrangements. The LL will set up the indemnity fund. For owners that suffer from loss of ownership, then indemnity will be provided, and that will actually be established and operated on a self-financing basis. The indemnity is to be paid out from the indemnity fund, which is built up by levy on transfers registered under the LTO. We have actually engaged the services of a consultant, and taking into account the self-sustainability of the indemnity fund as well as the level of public acceptance, we propose that the indemnity cap be at 50 million Hong Kong dollars as compared to $30 million when it was first proposed in 2004, and a flat levy rate of 0.014% on the consideration amount of each property being transferred. Over 99% of assignments registered at the LR in previous years involved consideration up to $50 million. And actually, many of them are around 10 million or under. Therefore, in accordance with the flat levy rate, the highest levy rate will be around 7,000 Hong Kong dollars. And as most of the assignments are under 10 million or under, we're talking about $4,000 or less. To provide sufficient buffer for indemnity payment, a standby loan facility of $150 million for the fund from the government can be made available, and that is subject to the approval of the Finance Committee of the Legislative Council. We will review the above figures nearer the time during the legislative amendment exercise to implement the new Land First proposal. Now, subject to the views of members today, we will proceed to prepare legislative amendments to the LTO to implement the new Land First proposal. Our target is to introduce a Land Titles Amendment Bill into LegCo in early 2024. We will also continue to engage stakeholders to work out implementation details, including the preparation of 5 subsidiary legislation and practice guides for conveyancing and registration in respect of properties covered by the proposal. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Tam. Thank you for your detailed introduction. It's now time for members to ask questions. 8 members wish to speak. Mr. Lau Kwok Fan, Mr. Kenneth Lau, Ms. Doreen Kong, Mr. Andrew Lam, Ms. Judy Chen, Mr. Louis Long, Dr. Wendy Hong, and Mr. Xiu Ka-fei. 4 minutes each. Mr. Lau Kwok Fan. Thank you, Chairman. Of course, I'm in support of the title registration, but why do we need 18 years before the land titles ordinance can be enacted? Well, looking back at the World Bank business environment report, I see that Hong Kong actually enjoys a very competitive business environment. It's just that for the land titles, we rank very low. I'm not sure whether this is related to the land title system that we have in Hong Kong. This is actually a good system because it can provide more guarantee and certainty for land titles, including enjoying an indefeasible title, and that there will be less disputes. Many of the land in new territories now are under consideration of adverse possession. We hope actually to repeal that system, but then the government refuses to do that. The land titles or title registration system will only be implemented for newly granted land. So when can the land in new territories also adopt this system? There is not much on the conveyance transfer or the conversion mechanism in the paper. You used 18 years to bring this up again. So can you tell us more about the timetable? Well, let's say the conversion mechanism will be done at a later date. Can you actually allow us to have an automatic conversion mechanism? Let's say I'm an owner of a site of land in new territories. I really enjoy this system. I hope that I could adopt this system and to register it myself. Would you allow a person to voluntarily transfer to this new conversion mechanism? Thank you for your question. The Land Titles Ordinance was enacted in 2004, and it is today that we bring this back up in the LegCo because we had encountered some setbacks. How can we actually convert it to new land? But under the current system, there is some ambiguity and uncertainty. An automatic conversion mechanism actually will bring these old problems into their new system. We actually want to make clear the land title, but by having an automatic conversion mechanism, it will actually bring more uncertainty. And that is a challenge for us. Well, you asked about the next step. I can say that we're actually not opening the door wide enough for the new system to just allow this option for newly granted land. However, we are going to try our best to formulate legislation and to think about the conversion mechanism for existing land. Once this is passed, we hope more views could be brought up to discuss with the LegCo or other stakeholders. But only after this legislation has been passed. Well, as to whether we allow automatic conversion, we would consider this as an option. We cannot adopt this at the current moment because after consideration, we found that when we are actually making the conversion automatically, we have to ensure that the land title is a clear and certain title. Not yet having the mechanism in place, we do not want to affect the newly granted land. We would, however, consider this for existing land, and we would take this into consideration.
Mr. Kenneth Lau, in 2004, the Land Titles Ordinance was enacted. There was a steering committee and also a review committee on supervising the implementation. The Hon Yuet-ming has been part of a process reflecting the comments from our stakeholders and offering advice on how to enhance the system. This remains a controversial issue over the years. This has to do with the conversion of the land registered under the deed system to the new system. Then there is this new proposal, new land first proposal. This will align our practice with our country's practice. This will help us integrate into national development, make us more competitive. The indemnity system under this proposal will also safeguard the interests of owners. I welcome this proposal as this is finally bearing fruit. But then I have some questions. Paragraph 9 in the paper says that the mandatory rectification rule will be abolished. So for land registered under the current system, the deed system, if there is fraud, what will be done? If the owner does not want the indemnity, will the mandatory rectification system be applicable to land registered under the old system? Ms. Doris Ho? We will be abolishing the mandatory rectification rule for newly granted land. Newly granted land usually involves projects where property developers build new buildings and then sell the property to buyers. So in those cases, people don't have to worry about conversion. Now, but what about land already registered under the old system? We will have to examine the mandatory rectification mechanism. We haven't formed a final view on this. Things are all interrelated. How do we migrate the land under the old system to the new system? We need a mechanism to ensure there's good title for the land going from the old system to the new system. That will also have a bearing on whether there is a need for mandatory rectification. So we will explore these issues when we explore what to do with land registered under the current system. Next, Ms. Doreen Call. Chair, I'm a solicitor in conveyancing. I was on the committee on the related matters at the Land Department. Now, for the indemnity, the cap is now proposed to be $50 million. There are many investors in Hong Kong. They buy property that is well over $50 million. The government figures said that most property costs less than $50 million. So what if you have a fund, a professional investor? What safeguard is there for professional investors buying costly property? Now, the government loan facility will be $150 million. If each project costs the government $50 million in indemnity, then you just need 3 such cases to use up the loan facility. What will be done? Now, for the threshold under the new property, the buyer has to be in possession of the property for value. But what about those renting the property? Many people are letting out their property, many people are renting. If the proposal safeguards the interests of those who own the property for value, then what safeguard is there for those professional investors buying the property and letting it out? Now I want to turn to the question about education. The newly granted land proposal or the new land first proposal has been floated for many years. How do people in general tell the differences between the new system and the old system? You need a different provisional sale and purchase agreement. When you have a new land first proposal, what would be done about public education? How long would the public education change? And I disagree with the government's proposal with the new levy. Why do people have to pay for the new land first proposal? If this is a proposal that is good for the government, then the government should help maintain the system. The government will be charging 0.014% in levy from the people. Buyers of property already paying a hefty amount in buyer stamp duty, and now they're asked to pay a levy for the new land first proposal. That's a lot of money. Will there be further public consultations for the new land first proposal down the road? Under the indemnity mechanism, the indemnity will cover property value up to $50 million when institutional investors purchase property and the value is caught up in a fraud. The indemnity will cover only up to $50 million. That is the cap. Now we get the point put across by Ms. Kong. For property over $50 million, the indemnity will only offer partial rather than full indemnity. Indeed, if we charge a higher levy, then not many people will find it affordable. But to offer full compensation to institutional investors, you will need a higher levy, and that will be less affordable to the average buyer. Now, as for the cap, the government loan facility of $150 million, Ms. Joyce Tam can tell us more in a moment. Now, the requirement about in possession of the property for value. As Ms. Kong was saying, the threshold also covers owners who let out their property, so they are protected. Now, turning to public education, as the government, or rather when the Legislative Council scrutinizes the bill, that will be a process for the public to familiarize themselves with the bill, and then there will be 6 to 9 months for public education for the trade property owners and prospective property owners and the members of the public in general. Ms. Joyce Tam. the people are concerned about the indemnity. We engaged a consultant to help us assess the risks of the mechanism. We considered these factors. As I mentioned in my presentation, $50 million covers over 99% of property transactions. If we raise the indemnity cap to $100 million, or if we have no cap at all, we ask the consultant to do an assessment. If we have $100 million as the cap, then the levy will be 8 times as high as what we are proposing, so that may not be practicable. Less than 1% of high-end property may cost more than $50 million. And if such cases come up and fraud is involved, then the indemnity fund will be used up very quickly. More than 85% of property transactions involve property less than $10 million. So if we raise the levy, that means we're asking small property owners to subsidize the indemnity fund for high-end homes. The indemnity will be operated on a self-financing basis. The consultant helped us look at the model in terms of its financial sustainability. If the government operates the fund, that means the taxpayers pay for the indemnity fund. That raises issues of fairness. After considering various factors, we proposed a cap of $50 million and the levy at 0.014%. This level will be more reasonable and acceptable to people. The stamp duty costs a lot of money, but then the indemnity is more like an insurance. The premium is not a huge sum. Then the payout will be capped at $50 million. That's at a reasonable level. Will there be a public consultation for this new land first proposal? If there is insufficient fund under the indemnity, will the government pay for the shortfall? We have run a number of simulations for various scenarios. We propose to apply the scheme to newly granted land only. The title is more likely to be clean, and the land is less likely to come with encumbrances. Under the regime, there are ways to prevent fraud. The consultant has considered various scenarios in running the test. The conclusion is that $150 million in loan facility will be enough. If we do find out there's a shortfall, we will discuss the matter with the relevant government departments, and any new funding application will have to go through the Finance Committee of the LegCo. But what about public consultation? The new Land First proposal has the support of stakeholders. For the drafting of the legislative amendment, we don't have plans for public consultations. Apart from working on the main legislation, there are also 5 pieces of subsidiary legislation concerning the nitty-gritty of the proposal. The sectors, especially the legal profession, may be concerned about the nitty-gritty. So in drafting the subsidiary legislation, we will get in touch with the professions, but we will not have a public consultation. Next to Mr. Andrew Lam.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, this is a very small step, and after so long, there are expectations from the sector, and I agree this in principle, but we are only taking a very small step. So would the government consider also adopting this system in existing land? However, in the new territories, there are many problems with land ownership. When, as the Permanent Secretary said, you would conduct a thorough in study. Would you actually consider that as well? The Permanent Secretary, in her introduction, talked about the new land, including land granted by way of land sale, private treaty grant, and land exchange. My question is, I don't have specific figures on old deeds registration with new buildings. If you include that as well, what will the risk be? Let's say this is non-voluntarily. What kind of risk would you see? If there is not much risk, I really want the administration to consider, because every year there is a certain number of such cases in the market. I cannot see the risk for these small owners on whether there is a difference between them and the new land. Thank you. Yes, I know that we're only taking baby steps. If possible, we do want to take a bigger step forward. Previously, we have discussed this with members and we have received very concrete views. For example, some land has been granted by the government, but this has already been granted before the LTO. But then when they sell it, then it's after the enactment of the LTO. So this would not actually go under the definition of new land. But we do want to open the door wider, because there doesn't seem to be too many issues with this sort of newly granted land. For redevelopment, it may be a set of different circumstances. The Urban Renewal Authority, when resuming land less than 70%, the government will need to give assistance, and so all the land resumed would have to be returned to the government, and then the government will then return it 100% to the owner. So it's sort of like surrender and grant, which could fall under the definition of newly granted land. But then for land granted by way of auction in land sale, then there is no need for them to come to the government for land exchange. Or there may be a possibility, as I'm not certain that this will happen, the property developer may have already settled the land ownership, although some of it remains vague. By making the conversion over to this new system will mean that these existing issues will be brought over. We would rather leave this to handle in the next step. As for land and new territories, we know that there has always been disputes, and we have heard different views. Currently, for evidence that landowners can provide, the lands registry will consider, and then there is actually a mechanism to amend that. However, at the present moment, we're not looking into major changes, because when you actually make such differentiations, then it may affect different owners and it may lead to further disputes. Therefore, we are not looking into any major changes at the moment. Well, there are 4 members who have expressed their wish to speak. Our meeting is scheduled to end at 4:30, and I would use my discretion as chairman to extend the meeting by no more than 15 minutes. I hope that we will not go over time for too long. Next, Ms. Judy Chen. Thank you, Chairman. A small step is better than nothing. To provide more certainty and reassurance to land owners is something that needs our support. I see that there's already a draft since 2004. Can we actually try to speed up the process, even if it is such a tiny step? The PS said they will only consult stakeholders and not conduct a public consultation. However, you can really learn more information from public consultation. You might not get the same results through investigation. So why can't you conduct a 2-week public consultation? Because it wouldn't affect your speed at all. I suggest you consider holding public consultation. This proposal is called a New Land First proposal, and this gives the public the impression that it is a tiny step, and then after learning from such experience, it would take a second and third step. Would you actually have a blueprint for your future developments? Thank you. In 2004, when the ordinance was enacted, we also brought up 5 subsidiary legislations for the LegCo's approval. We do want to expedite the process. I hope members will understand that there is not too much dispute over the general principle, because we have already spent a lot of time going back and forth. This, however, is a major change. We try our best to consult stakeholders to ensure smooth process, but as to what the next step will be, as I said so to Mr. Lau Kwok Fun, we are continuing our drafting of the legislation, and we are looking into the conversion mechanism. We have set a target for ourselves that when the legislation is passed, there would already be recommendations on the conversion mechanism, which can be discussed with all stakeholders. Mr. Louis Long, I would like to declare interest. I'm actually a member of the steering committee on the lands titles. I actually support the new land first proposal because we do need to take a first step before we can understand other challenges and problems ahead. I have a similar concern with Ms. Doreen Kong. Although you have enhanced the cap from 35 million to 50 million, it is actually not yet enough. I know this is actually built up by levy, and the levy cannot be set too high. There is actually a solution. Since 2010, when the government has looked into the demand control and demand management duty. And so this is not actually a regular tax. It is actually to suppress demand. And so this is an extra form of income. Would that actually resolve the issue on levy? The loan facility of 150 million is a very small number. You can actually allocate part of it from the taxes to the indemnity fund, and that can actually raise the indemnity cap. I want to see how the PS thinks of this proposal. Thank you. The indemnity fund is to be built up by levy on transfers registered under the LTO. So this is to be established and operated on a self-financing basis. Can we actually allocate some of the money from the stamp duty to the fund? We do have a principle in public works that taxes collected should be returned to the government, and the government will have the decision on where the money will be allocated to. The proposal you gave violates the principle, and therefore we cannot do that. We hope that the indemnity fund could operate on a self-financing basis, and the levy actually is sustainable and affordable. To raise the cap of the indemnity will also at the same time increase the levy rate, and that will bring a heavier burden on small owners. Therefore, we need to strike a balance. I'd like to follow up, PS. It seems that you have considered it thoroughly, that by putting 150 million in the loan facility will not be too much of a problem. Can you actually increase the loan facility and just put more money in the fund so that when the fund can self-sustain, then you can return the money to the government? Would there be such an option so that there could be more buffer? Can you actually consider this? Because 50 million does not seem a lot. For some of the larger properties, that really is too small a figure. I hope you can also consider this option as well. Next, Dr. Wendy Hong.
主席，我想係即係
Chair, just one more thing from me. I agree with you, and I want to clarify one point. I understand this fiscal principle the government sticks to. I'm not asking the government to take money from one pocket and put it into another area. I'm just saying, figuratively speaking, the government has taken in so much money from one area. I'm just saying there's nothing wrong about putting money elsewhere. There is room for the government to look into ways to increase the amount covered by the indemnity. Next, Dr. Wendy Hong. The indefeasible principle in title is very important, not just for land transaction, but also for urban development as a whole. But for land registered under the old system, the paper does not set out a clear timetable or roadmap. We need certainty of title for land registered under the deed registration system too. The government acknowledges the complex process in conveyancing. So I hope there can be a roadmap. The owner of a property also has the duty to clarify the title. How about we set a cutoff date, and then after a certain date, all the titles still there become indefeasible titles. The title holders should clarify their own title. The government cannot be expected to clarify the title of every single piece of property one by one. The paper says that title applications can be processed through electronic means. I encourage greater use of property technology by the government. Property tech is a core area, and this represents a key element of our future smart city. When I talked to the Director of Lands, we talked about possible incentives for people to register their title electronically. Can we offer further incentives for people to make greater use of technology such as blockchain, so that we can achieve computerization of the title registration process more quickly? The director, Ms. Tam, will address the tech part of it. But just one word from me about the conversion. The land currently registered old system. Dr. Hong proposed a possible way, so set a cutoff date, and then after that date, the property goes under the new system. There was a proposal like this, but then the proposal went through rounds of discussions. People are not comfortable about this. If you have an automatic transfer or conversion, but there's a lack of a system or a mechanism to uncover all those title issues, and there's no one to check to make sure the titles are good titles, people are uncomfortable about going ahead. Overseas experience shows that in some places, people take an incremental approach. That is, they do it step by step. So people do something like the voluntary registration system raised by Mr. Edward Lau. Or whenever you have a new transaction, then people have to go by the new system. That's another approach adopted overseas. In some places, the government does part of the work. The government checks whether the title is good before the migration happens. These are the things we will be exploring at the next stage. Ms. Joyce Tam will address the tech part of it. We will have to make greater use of information technology. We are exploring the use of blockchain so that solicitors can look at the title certificate during property transactions. This becomes a secure way for solicitors to verify the title certificate and make sure they are indeed issued by the land registry. There's also a system for electronic submission of applications. Law firms are encouraged to submit their applications electronically. So there will be different fee levels to encourage people to use the electronic system. We will also consider other possible means. Now, as for other ways to make use of technology, we're working with the OGCIO on possible ways forward so that we can make greater use of information technology and also give people a more user-friendly experience, whether it's a member of the public or solicitors or other stakeholders. Mr. Peter Xu, in recent years, we've heard that after a buyer goes to the solicitor, they realize that the purported seller turns out to be a fraudster. So the money goes to the fraudster. You can find that kind of news on the internet. When someone buys a piece of property, the solicitor has to check the title document. And everything looks good, the transaction goes through and is completed. But then if it turns out to be a case of fraud, then the buyer is defrauded of their money, but the seller is innocent. But look at this new proposal. Even if it turns out that the deed documents are forgery, as long as the buyer has possession of the property for value, there may be people who are outside Hong Kong, but they have property in Hong Kong, and then they realize that someone is occupying their property because someone poses as them and sells the property. This is where we are heading with this new proposal. Under the current system, if an owner realizes that someone else has occupied their property, they can call the police. For prospective buyers, they have to engage solicitors, go through the deed document carefully. I know there are people forging Hong Kong ID cards, making things hard for solicitors. You just need a system to address these problems. Otherwise, you get fraud down the road. Can we set up a hotline for buyers and sellers to verify the identity of the other party? Offer better security during the transaction. The proposal here means that even if a new buyer buys new property and the documents turn out to be forgeries, then the original owner loses the property. You may have someone living in the UK, but they own property in the new territories, and one day they come back to Hong Kong, they realize their property is gone. What happens then? Chair, I have only 4 minutes left. I know what the Permanent Secretary was about to say. I know what this plan is about. Just then, I put forward these points, and the Permanent Secretary already knows what I was saying. I don't go to check up on my property every day. I don't have to worry about that under the current regime. A buyer who fails to conduct due diligence suffers loss. This is the duty of a prospective buyer to check to make sure everything's right. But even under the new system, the current owner will be the one suffering. That's what happens when. That's the kind of thing that happened when people encountered in the past. Mr. Peter Shiu, you have already put your point across. We would like to give a chance to the Permanent Secretary to give a response. Mr. Edward Lau would like to speak for the second round. We have to end the meeting at 4:45. So we will give Mr. Edward Lau the floor now. Chair. I want to follow up on the point about voluntary registration. I'm pleased to hear that the government is willing to explore the possibility of voluntary registration. The government said for cases of indeterminate ownership, these cases are few and far between, but there's no reason to hold back the system simply because of the minority of such cases. For land resumption at the moment, when the ownership is unclear, there is an agreement on compensation and indemnity. There are various ways to go about it. It's only a question of whether the government is willing to go ahead with a certain approach. I just want greater clarity on what kind of approach the government will take and whether there will be a timetable. And my point is that adverse possession is an outdated concept. Some places overseas have abolished this concept. Our Law Reform Commission has indicated that the adverse possession should be improved, or there should be at least some sort of notification for the current owner. The proposal here only covers new land, but what about land registered under the current system? Even if the government decides not to do voluntary registration, what can we do to get rid of adverse possession? Permanent Secretary, you have a minute and a half to respond to the question and also the question from Mr. Peter Shiu. Now I will address the point about adverse possession first. The Law Reform Commission made a recommendation for us to deal with adverse possession as we implement its title registration system. Members of the public take private property seriously, and people should not be allowed to deprive others of ownership to property by occupying the property for a long time. So under the new proposal, there won't be adverse possession for newly granted land. But what about land registered under the current system? We will review and explore this matter as we look into how to deal with land registered under the current regime. Turning to voluntary registration. If the new land first proposal works we will try to expand the scope. There are problems associated with a voluntary registration scheme. We will see if the problems can be overcome. Turning to the issue raised by Mr. Peter Shiu, we propose to abolish mandatory rectification. Sorry to interrupt you, Permanent Secretary. We have to wrap up at 4:45. There are only 20 seconds left. I can give the Permanent Secretary a few more minutes. If members do not object, we will extend the meeting for another 5 minutes for the Permanent Secretary to finish.
I'd like to explain that for the new Land First proposal, we hope to ensure that in future in the land titles, the title registration will then be indefeasible. But then 3 requirements must be met. First of all, that person must be a bona fide purchaser. Second, he paid in value. And thirdly, that person is in possession of the property. So that person either lives there or as a owner has leased out the property. So if I am the existing owner, as long, well, maybe I am living there myself, my property if it's sold out by fraudulent transfer will be a very slim chance only. Therefore, we are going to raise public awareness. We want to let the public understand that a property owner must manage its property carefully to ensure that it would not be transferred out via fraud. And that a notification would also be sent out to the registered owner in any transactions. We hope that under the new system, when there is an application of registration lodged, we will, in the form of email, followed by a SMS, will notify the owner that there is a registration application lodged. And this can alert the registered owners to discover possible fraud at an early stage and take action as necessary. It seems there may be some different arrangements for owners. We are just trying our best to ensure that we'll be able to guarantee the benefits of the owner. All right, our discussion will close here today. There is no AOB item. We'd like to thank the administration for attending. The meeting is adjourned.